Um, yes, I'm not Michael. I'm chairing this evening, and there will be questions, and I'll ask you to wait until Paul, who's doing the roving mic, to give you the mic so we can all be clearly heard. So in that, I'll welcome Michael, and over to you. Mobiles, sorry, please, off or silent would be great. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say a thank you to Andrew and to the wonderful team here at St Mary's for making us so welcome this evening. And I'm here to listen to the points that you have to tell me and to the questions that you want to ask me. So I shall sit down and allow Richard to act as our chair.
Thank you. So who would like to go first? Murray. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I think one of the features of St Mary's is it operates and has done a great deal of work in the field of a food bank and is helping a great number of people. And I know you commented, and some of the people took that very badly, about that the food bank was unnecessary because, as you said, people who already had jobs were going to the food bank. However, the latest figures indicate there are 3 million people in this country in work and are still in need of going to a food bank. So I wonder what now is your view about the role of food banks, unfortunately, and the role they play in supporting many people in this country.
Well, the first thing to say is I think that those who volunteer and work in food banks do an amazing job, and we should celebrate and thank them. The second thing is, I think it was another MP who made that particular quote. I was attacked for saying that sometimes people go to food banks because they have problems managing their money. And people inferred from that I was trying to say that people in this country, everyone in this country, has enough. Manifestly, they don't. There are some people who are living in real poverty. But it is also the case, having visited food banks myself, that I know that people visit them for a variety of reasons and with a variety of different causes. There are some people who are in real poverty and need the support of others. There are some people who, because of a mix-up, an unfortunate mix-up, either in pay from work or in the benefit system, are going through a dip in their income and they need to supplement it, and then they can be back on their feet financially after a week, a month, or a particular period. But there are also a number of people who do visit food banks who are also living with a number of very difficult conditions. There are some people who are living with mental health problems and other challenges in their life. And going to a food bank is a way not just of getting some of the necessities of life when they may be having difficulty managing their money, but also a way of making sure you can make connections with a friendly individual or group who want to help you and can help you not just get the food that you need to see you through a difficult time, but the broader support that you might need in order to get your life back on track. I also know that one of the problems that we face, not just in Surrey Heath, but globally, or rather throughout the UK, is homelessness. So it's not just the case that there are people who have accommodation but need food. There are people who need both. And the Hope Hub, which is an organisation that's been set up, which I know many people here support, and is supported so strongly by Churches Together in Camberley, helps provide, through a dedicated team, the support that people need, particularly those who have mental health and addiction problems. The final thing that I was going to say is that earlier, rather towards the end of last year, we were able to announce a new fund, a £15 million fund, in order to ensure that some of the surplus food that would otherwise be thrown away from retailers and cafes, which was still healthy and nutritious, could then be redistributed towards food banks and charities like FareShare, which make sure that food goes to those most in need. So I absolutely think that we need to support food banks and the work that they do, and the reason why we need them is because there are many complex challenges that people face in Britain today, from poverty through, as I say, mental health and other addiction issues, to just the sheer misfortune that can afflict anyone who is trying to do the right thing, but who finds themselves at the mercy of circumstances they can't control.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, Mr. Gove. If re-elected to Surrey Heath, what will you do as our MP for the poorest in our community?
Well, I think there's a lot that we can do in order to help the very poorest in our community. I think a lot that we have been doing, but there's always more. I think the first thing to recognise with many of those who are the very poorest, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's often the case that they will have grown up themselves in circumstances where they will have been denied the support structures necessary, which most of us here will have enjoyed, which lead to a happier life. Many of the very poorest in our society are people who have grown up in homes where they will have witnessed domestic violence, or where they will have been denied not just the material resources, but also the love that they need in order to feel truly valued and strong and resilient and confident. And when I was Justice Secretary and I was responsible for dealing with the fate of many people who found themselves in the criminal justice system and in prison, I saw that in many cases these were people who were just as much victims as those they had committed crimes against because of the really difficult circumstances in which they'd grown up. So one of the most important things we can do is to support families and to get behind social workers who ensure that when families are facing stress, that they can stick together in the interests of the children, but also, if necessary, and it is sadly necessary in a number of cases, that the most vulnerable children can be removed from homes where they're not being cared for properly and placed with adoptive or foster parents, or indeed kinship carers, grandparents and others, in order to get an appropriate start in life. The next stage after that, of course, is what happens when children are in school. And one of the things that we've done is to make sure that the very poorest children in school have an extra amount of money attached to them, the pupil premium, which means that those schools that have a higher proportion of children eligible for free school meals get extra cash. One of the other things that we've done is also made sure that children who are at primary school are eligible for free school meals universally, so that what might have been thought of as the stigma of applying for free school meals has gone. Every child now has a nutritious lunch, whichever primary school they attend. Now, the other area, of course, is when it comes to people trying to enter the job market. And there are particular challenges there for people who may not have the backing at home and the support and the good fortune to go to a very good school. And that's why we've been investing in new opportunities in further education and in training in order to provide people who may not have had the best experience at school with a second or third chance to get the qualifications they need. And then the final thing that we need to do is to make sure that universal credit works. It's a new system of delivering benefits. We know that there have been a number of criticisms of its delivery, but Amber Rudd, the Work and Pension Secretary, has recently got more money from the Treasury in order to help the change. And the experience so far has been that for people who've moved smoothly to universal credit, it is a system that ensures that there is less bureaucracy and greater simplicity in getting the benefits that they want. But I don't think anyone, certainly not Amber or the Prime Minister, would say it is perfect yet. And then I think the final thing is just taking a step back. These are all things that government can do. But ultimately, when it comes to people who face poverty, one of the most important things, as well as material resources, is the quality of the relationships that they have. And one of the big problems I think that we face as a society now is the growing epidemic of loneliness, of isolation, of the failure of the neighbourliness with which most of us have grown up to survive into the 21st century. So I think there's a role for me in supporting those organisations, churches, charities and others that are always there for people who may find themselves on their own and facing tough times. And I think that that is not something that politicians should shout about, but it is something that we have to throw our energy behind, because it's often the case that those best equipped to help someone through a difficult time are people of faith or people who are motivated for other reasons to work in public service or for charitable organisations.
Lady at the back, please.
Thank you. Mr. Gove, firstly, this is two issues really about animal welfare. Firstly, I would like to say to you that I applaud you for the action that you took on plastic straws. But I would also say that I'm absolutely appalled about the badger culling, because it is against everything that the Royal Veterinary College and scientists who have spent years working on this. You are not going to eradicate bovine TB. You might eradicate it by 16%, but 86% is due to bad management within the cattle industry, as we know. I'm not a vegan. I eat milk, and I drink milk, and I eat meat. But it's just, to me, we are taking a very simple route to placate a small number of people by eradicating one of our national emblems. On that basis, and I am a local resident, I was contacted by Somerset Against the Badger Cull, and I have this award that they've asked me to give to you. Would you accept it from me?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I see. The first thing to say is, I think almost everyone in this room will appreciate, not least because of the beautiful environment around us here in Surrey, how much the natural world matters, and how much we are part of the same web of creation and evolution with badgers, cows, with all of nature, all of creation. And therefore, to willingly to take the life of an animal requires thought and reflection, because we're doing damage to creation in a particular way. Now, of course, both of us, as meat eaters and milk drinkers, recognize that there comes a time in the life of farmed animals when we want to see them end their lives well, which is why we've recently, in this government, ensured that we have CCTV in abattoirs to make sure that animals are killed in a humane way, because they are bred and they live in order to be suppliers of food to us. And indeed, the role that they play in farms is integral to the success of those farms when it comes to growing cereals. Mixed farming, which has livestock alongside cereals, is the most natural way, most environmentalists think, of ensuring that farming can survive alongside flourishing nature. Now, of course, the reason that badgers are culled is not because anyone takes any pleasure or relish in it, but there are always times when certain populations of certain animals in the world are culled in order to try to keep nature in balance. So we know that, for example, if you have an overpopulation of deer in a particular area, that can have a devastating impact on trees and forests, and that in turn can have an impact on other creatures, from red squirrels to wild birds, all of which deserve equal recognition and respect. The reason why badgers are culled is because they are, following their designation for understandable reasons as a protected species, their numbers have increased. And as their numbers have increased, so the incidence of bovine tuberculosis in the world has grown as well. Now, you're absolutely right that there are steps that we need to take in order to ensure that cattle which are infected are better managed, that we don't have the infection spreading through unscrupulous cattle dealers or a tiny minority of farmers who want to cut corners. And Sir Charles Godfrey's recent report emphasised the importance of taking action in that way. But it is also the case that Charles Godfrey, who was appointed as an independent expert, said that the cull so far has had a measurable impact in reducing the incidence of TB. Now, as I say, there is more that we want to do, and I've been working with charities, including the Save Me Trust, which is dedicated to looking after wildlife and trying to find a better way than the current badger cull. And I've been working with them to look at trials for different attempts to introduce vaccination and different forms of management. So it's not carried on with any relish or with any sense of anything other than that this is a necessary step in order to try to reduce this disease. Because bovine TB being carried by badgers also leads to infection not just in cattle but in other animals as well, which means that they too suffer and they too face a premature and in some cases more painful death. So everything has to be held in balance. There's another thing as well, which is that the numbers of badgers overall have increased in this country, and there is some evidence that the increase in badger numbers has had a deleterious effect on the number of hedgehogs in the countryside as well. So I'm not saying that's a reason for the current policy. There are, as I hope I've taken some time to explain, a complex of reasons behind it. I can understand why people don't approve of the cull, but we try to take a balanced view, and I hope that people will realise that it's a sincere attempt on our part to deal with a complex and multifaceted issue.
Thank you. Now, I failed miserably in my chairmanship because I was supposed to ask your name, please, when you ask a question, and where you're from, whether it be, Camberley or Frimley or whatever. So if you could do that, that would be much appreciated. Thank you. And this gentleman over here, please.
It's good to see you, very good to see you, Michael. I was asked to send in a question, which I did, and having composed it, I will, if you don't mind, read it. Anyhow, given that pavements are meant for walkers, mothers pushing buggies and the disabled, and that repeatedly mounting them to park not only obstructs but results in damage to the curbs, could you please tell me when the legislation banning cars from parking on them is going to be made available to councils outside London, and whether Surrey Heath will be implementing it to rid us of this increasingly habitual and wholly unnecessary practice of motorists parking on pavements. As a small rider, this is something that never makes any difference to whether more cars can pass abreast or to the different distance left between the parked car and the passing vehicles. It merely serves to encourage faster traffic in our streets.
Well, for those who don't know, Quentin, who asked the question, is a local resident and a passionate campaigner on a number of issues, including dealing with some of the problems of waste and rubbish that we all face. And I completely agree with your point. I've found that on those occasions when I have parked in London, I have seen the patrolling traffic wardens and enforcement officers ensure that when people are parking in designated spaces for which they have to pay, that they're squarely, as it were, in that parking zone. And if there's a rear wheel or both wheels on the pavement, or if you're outside the zone, then a fine is issued, as surely as if you hadn't paid a ticket at all. Now, I don't know when those powers are likely to be extended, and the decision as to whether or not, if they were extended, they would be exercised in Surrey Heath will be a matter for the local council. But I do think that you are right to draw attention to this, because it's simply one of a number of ways in which careless parking can lead to the sorts of problems that you've identified. And I know from my postbag and from experience that there are a number of parts of Surrey Heath where careless and thoughtless parking causes frustration, not just to local residents, but also to public service workers. We often have examples of careless and thoughtless parking near Frimley Park Hospital, which is a particular impediment for the many staff who work there. So I would encourage the wider spread of the use of those powers, and ultimately it will be for our councillors to decide when and how they might be used, but I think it would be a useful tool in their armoury which we in government should supply them with.
Gentleman over here.
Good evening, Michael. Nice to see you again. Nobody's mentioned the infamous B word yet. I'm going to do that now.
Well, badgers.
No, not badgers. Well, a different form of badger. I'm going to quote a couple of instances. I'd like to welcome your comment. At the time Edward Heath was discussing our entry into the EEC. Sorry, what was your name there? Sorry, my name is Peter Broughton. Oh, right, thank you. You know. Cheeky man.
Thank you for your assistance, Christopher.
Cheeky man. A certain Mr. Monet, he was the finance minister of France, said to our Prime Minister that our joining the EEC was the first stage to full political integration, but to keep it under his hat. Well, Mr. Heath kept this under his hat, and we are... And we are all voted for the first lie in the process of the EU or EEC. That's the first big lie in this sordid mess. The second one goes a bit earlier. A few words from the end of the speech by Winston Churchill in 1933. This before Hitler really got started. I quote, "Nothing can save England if she will not save herself. If we lose faith in ourselves, in our capacity to guide and to govern, if we lose our will to live, then indeed our story is told." We're finished. End of quotation. It means game over. This is what Brexit issue is all about, in my view.
I think, well, thank you, Peter. I mean, Peter, as some of you may know, is a very distinguished engineer. And one of the things about those two quotes is that they remind us that Britain's relationship, England's relationship with Europe, has been an issue of contention throughout all our history. And at different times, Britain has moved closer and further away from Europe. But generally, and this is my view, Britain's always been stronger when our institutions have meant that those who are leading them are accountable to the people. And one of the things, I know Brexit has many challenges, but one of the things that I think is a good thing about it is that it does mean there is a greater level of accountability. one of the things I think that's been annoying, whatever view you take of the European Union, is that sometimes politicians have said, when you complain about a particular policy, oh, I can't do that, Europe made me do it. And I think that that's frustrating, understandably, for citizens. If we politicians think that something is right, we have a responsibility to defend it or to change it and to be accountable as a result. I know that for many people, however they voted, these can be uncertain times as we move closer to March the 29th without a perfect resolution. But I'm hopeful, and certainly everything that I've seen in the course of the last couple of days leads me to believe that we will see a little bit of movement on the European side in a way which means that we can leave in good order. Because I think two things are important, both that we leave and that we honour the majority votes to leave, but also that we do so in a way which means that we remain on good terms with our friends and neighbours, because they are also going through some tough times at the moment. As some of you may have seen, Italy's in recession, and the French have withdrawn their ambassador from Rome because of some friction there. You know, we would want to settle Brexit in a good, clean way so that we can then actually be a good neighbour rather than a surly lodger.
Good evening, Michael. Charlie Ward. I live in Camberley. Where am I from? A bit further north. So, Michael, I'd like to come back to the environment. Your 25-year environmental plan, your footnote says, we want to protect the environment from exploitation. Today in the BBC, on the other hand, we've got the topic of the 300,000 houses that the government set. What it is meant is for lots of councils that cannot provide a 5-year housing supply, it's given a carte blanche for developers to jump in and try and build where they can. It's topical because here in Camberley we have a planning application for Teckles Park Estate, protected green space, but the developers using the logic, we can't have 5-year supply, therefore we're allowed to build. So I guess my question then is, you've got two sides of the government in contention. How do we give the councils the teeth to be able to fight that off? Because at the end of the day, it's workload for them, and the risk is to the environment. There's a big community action against it. To paraphrase Churchill, we've decided that we'll fight them for the beaches. But be interested just to get your view on what, from your point of view, can we do to make sure that your side of the government is that balanced with the other side that's trying to drive the housing?
Yes. Well, it's a huge issue. We do need more new homes because of our population having grown, and housing is increasingly unaffordable for younger people, for our children's generation. But at the same time, what we can't do is turn the whole of the south and southeast of England into one big megalopolis. We can't have London growing out so that we lose not just the green space that is an attractive amenity for people here, but also precious habitats and areas for wildlife. So we need to have balance. What we've done in the department that I'm in is say, if we have new housing development, there has to be a principle called net environmental gain. And that means that not only do the new houses have to be built in a way which minimizes the CO2 emissions in their construction, and also means that they're built in a way which means that it minimizes the need for car journeys for the people living and working in them, but also the developers need to put money aside in order to ensure that areas that have previously been damaged environmentally can be restored. There's a very good example of that in what's called the National Forest, which is a stretch of England that goes from Leicestershire through to Staffordshire and takes in southern Derbyshire. Those of you who know that part of the world will know that it used to be mining country and quarry country, and quite a lot of the original virgin countryside was terribly despoiled. Now it's being reclaimed, reforested, returned to nature. And one of the things that I think we can do is build more houses in what will be the new arc between Oxford, Milton Keynes and Cambridge. Oxford and Cambridge in particular are growing, and we can do so in a way that means that some of the land there, which at the moment is of relatively low environmental value, is improved. Now, I know Teckles Park, and I know that it has a particular value, not just because of its history, because of the Theosophical Society, but also because it's a beautiful green lung in the heart of Camberley. So, you know, without prejudice to the decision that our councillors will eventually have to make, I do think that it is important that all of us bear in mind the need to keep these things in balance, and I know that our councillors do.
Lady over there, please.
Hello, my name is Camilla Richardson and I'm from Windlesham. So, Mr. Gove, as the Environment Secretary, I'm just interested in finding out why you voted for Heathrow expansion, especially with the environmental concerns that we have, and also, as you know, we've had problems with plane noise overflowing the 3 villages. So, what are you doing about the looming IPA that Heathrow wants to put in place before the expansion? So that's 2 questions there.
Well, I do support Heathrow expansion. I think that there's a broad consensus, which of course not everyone agrees with, that we do need to expand aviation capacity in the southeast of England, just as we need to have more homes. It is the case that the aviation industry, to be fair to it, is improving the design of aircraft, reducing emissions, diminishing the amount of fuel upon which they rely, and there is pressure on them to do even more. But the principal environmental risk in expanding Heathrow is the risk to air quality from motor vehicles taking people to and from Heathrow. And therefore, the really important thing we need to do if we're thinking about expanding Heathrow is twofold. One, we need to make sure that Heathrow itself is, so far as it can be, all electric. That the vehicles that will take you from your aeroplane to the terminal are not diesel buses, but electric buses. That for the sake of argument, that the taxis or private hire vehicles that get into Heathrow treat Heathrow as an ultra-low emissions zone, so they have to be electric vehicles. But more than that, we want to minimize the number of such journeys by making sure that there are rail links north, south and west into Heathrow in order to ensure that the maximum number of people who are using it are travelling by public transport. If we do all those things, then we can ensure actually that Heathrow produces less air pollution than it does at the moment, because the air pollution that Heathrow does generate, the particulate matter, the NOx, is more than anything a consequence of the ground transport that's generated as it exists at the moment and as a result of its expansion. There's a related issue, of course, which is that there's noise pollution as well. And for people who want to know more about this issue, then on February the 22nd, I'm having another Q&A at the Briars in Lightwater. And that Q&A is one where I'm in the chair, and we have representatives from Heathrow, including the Chief Executive, John Holland Kay, who will be there to answer in detail the questions that you have and others have about the expansion and the impact that it might have on noise pollution and on the environment and on jobs as well, of course.
The lady over here, and then another question from this gentleman.
Thank you. Wendy Rowlands of Camberley. I'm going to read my question to you, if you don't mind, Michael. After the 29th of March, when the UK leaves the EU, will the cruel practice of the export of live animals for slaughter to European countries cease? Or will this practice continue, involving animals being transported often for many hundreds of miles across Europe?
Well, we want to cease the export of live animals to Europe in its current form. There are 2 particular challenges that we face, though. One is that as we define Europe, that of course will mean the Irish Republic, and it is the case that animals move across the Irish border in the course of food production in a way that we would not want to impede. And it is also the case, some people say, well, that's fine, just say that you can't have animals travelling by sea. One of the problems we also have is that we have farmers in Orkney and Shetland whose cattle travels from Orkney and Shetland to Aberdeen, to the abattoir there. And that's quite a long journey, albeit one that is that meets the highest welfare standards. So there are 2 things that we need to do. We need to make sure that we can have a particular circumstance that applies in Ireland, and we also need to make sure that either that we relocalise abattoirs in Orkney and Shetland, or that we can make sure that there are particular welfare standards that animals have to meet, which they do meet on the Orkney-Shetland route, but which they don't meet on other routes, and then we can institute the ban or restrictions that we need to in order to improve animal welfare.
Thank you. With all due respect, Mr. Gove, what, in your mind, makes you qualified for and or deserving of re-election?
Well, I'm the worst person you can ask that question to. I think the key thing is, you shouldn't mark your own homework. I'm very happy to talk about some of the things that I've done and I'm doing, but ultimately the judgment must be yours and everyone in this hall. So if you approve of what the Conservative government has done, or at least think that it might be better than the alternative, then I hope that you would vote for me. If you think that some of the things that we've been talking about have been good, if you think the 25-year environment plan has been a good thing, and that it's right that we should have an ambition to leave our environment in a better state than we inherited it, that we should be spending money on returning spoiled habitats to health, that it should be right that we should use the money that we give to farmers to improve the environment as well as to produce food. If you think it's right that we should have stricter rules on air and water pollution, then I hope you would vote for me, because those are the things that we've done. If you think education is important and you think it's a good thing that children are now 1.9 million more of them in more good and outstanding schools, I hope you would vote for the Conservatives and me, because that's a good thing. If you think that it's important that we spend more money on the NHS, then I hope you would think that the fact that we're now spending 20 billion more on the NHS and that 2.1 million people are in good and outstanding hospitals would be a reason to vote for the Conservatives. I hope that you would feel that the fact that there are more people in jobs now than there have been at any time in our history, and fewer children in workless households than at any time in history, would be good things, and that you could have confidence in me and in the Conservative Party to carry on delivering. And I would hope that if you've asked a question of me, or if you sought my advice or support as a constituent, I would hope that you've had, at the very least, a timely answer, and that I've tried as hard as I can in order to make sure that government listens, or the organisations that have treated you badly have listened and have made a difference. And I hope you'd also think that I've worked hard to make sure that I can work with our local councillors in the Conservative team to be responsive to your concerns. But of course, whenever the next election is, you might think, nah, and vote for someone else. And that's the glory of our democracy, that you will, that you will be able to do so with a glad heart.
Thank you for asking such an open question. Okay, and gentleman at the back there, please.
Doug Baker from Lightwater. I was just wondering, so before the Brexit referendum, you said that we held all the cards, and if we voted to leave, we'd get a good deal. Now, it seems that quite a lot of your colleagues in Parliament don't believe that you've got a good deal. And should you not be able to get a deal, how do you plan to protect the younger generation from the damage that leaving without one would do? And do you feel that pausing and stopping the process might be rather a good idea in that case?
I think one of the things that I stressed during the referendum is that once we'd chosen to leave, the pace and the manner was up to us. Decisions were taken about how to trigger Article 50, when to have a general election, and so on, which determined the path that we went down. But that wasn't the only path that we could have gone down. There were options there. But nevertheless, those decisions having been taken in that way, and the EU27 having responded in the way that they have, there is a deal on the table which, with some emendation, I think will work for everyone. When you've got 17.4 million people, 52% of the population voting to leave, admittedly, of those who indeed, but more people voted for this proposition than have ever voted for anything in our history. And of course, to win by more than 1 million votes is a decisive victory, though it's not a big one. And I think you're right that that means that there needs to be a spirit of compromise. And the deal the Prime Minister put forward is a compromise. It's appropriate to a country that voted 52-48. It's also appropriate in a parliament where no single party has a majority. And it's also appropriate when you've got 27 other countries, all of which have got their own interests, which need to be respected, if not always accommodated fully. And we are very close to that deal. It's the first time any country has ever left the European Union, and there's natural nervousness on the European side that if Britain is too much of a success outside, that may lead others to question their membership as well. So there is a nervousness on their side as well as naturally amongst citizens here. But I think that we can get a good deal. Now, if it's necessary to take a little bit longer, once a deal has been agreed in order to get legislation through the House of Commons, then I'm pragmatic and flexible about that. But certainly in the course of the last few days, there have been hopeful signs from what I've heard, not just privately in government, but publicly from leaders like Angela Merkel. And I do believe that the goodwill is there, because you're right that in the event of there being no deal, there would be difficulties here in the United Kingdom, but also difficulties for the people who work in northern France and the port of Calais, difficulties for people in the Republic of Ireland who rely on the land bridge through Wales and England to get their goods into the European market, difficulties for the Dutch. So much of their commerce depends through Rotterdam on British exports. And so I don't think any of us would want to see that outcome, and which is why I think that the opportunity is there for the right deal and for Britain to be able to move on to the next phase of its success.
My name's Marjorie Williams. I live in Camberley. I did send you a question to do with travellers. Why are they allowed to set up public companies, and everything they put on their website is false? Trading standards aren't interested in the way that they're acting. I mean, one particular company are registered as a landscaping company. They're actually a garage selling, well, they're not usable vehicles. And they fleeced me out of a lot of money. Under the Consumer Credit Act, I had a right within 30 days. Yeah. But bailiffs have been in, I've got a county court judgment and nothing. There's no way I can get my money back. And the government are permitting these people who said to me, "You do know we're gypsies," threatening me. So what can the government do about it?
Well, I think the first case is you have my full sympathy for having been the victim of a crime and having had someone sell something to you that was clearly faulty. And something as important as a car, you should have absolute confidence that when you're buying it, that you're buying it from a reliable seller. So you have my full sympathy. A crime, it appears, has been committed, and that should be properly investigated. And I don't know if my team have details of the particular offence, but if you wanted to share them with me by emailing my team with the precise details, we can ask the police to investigate this particular crime and to make sure the individual concerned. Well, that's good to hear. But if there are more steps that need to be taken, then we will take them. But the one thing that I would say, if you email us with the details of the specific case, then we will follow up, absolutely. Or write to me at the House of Commons, and we will follow up. And be delighted to. There's just one broad thing that I would say, which is that there's good and bad in every community, and it's just as likely that you might have been a victim of a crime from an old Etonian as from someone from a particular community. So I think that it's, we all sometimes feel after we may have been the victim of rudeness or criminality on the part of someone from a particular community, we might think, but it's important not to think that, because there are bad people who do silly things and wicked things and evil things, but then you mustn't tar, I certainly know that you would not, the whole of a particular community with one particular brush.
You think they would learn. They've been in prison, so why do it again?
I quite agree. For any individual, yes.
Okay, gentleman over here, please.
Thank you. Good evening, Michael. Michael Fiddler from Lightwater. I just am concerned, I've been a Surrey resident all my life. I'm concerned about the inexorable rise of council tax. It's becoming like a small mortgage now. Surrey seems to be one of the most expensive places to live. I do some work in Windsor. It seems to be 20 or 30% cheaper on council tax over there. So an example, a £1.5 million house is less on council tax by £1,000 a year than, say, a £700,000 house in Surrey. The council never seems to have any money. Dumps are closing. We need more journeys to go to Camberley, for example. More houses are being built. There's going to be more journeys. There never seems to be any money, yet the council tax is huge. Is government taking too much money away? Is our council inefficient? What's happening here? Why, you get less and less for more and more money. And that's my question, really. It's a concern.
Well, the first part of that is right. Surrey is almost uniquely disadvantaged in the way in which council tax support is allocated. And that's because for years, because it's been assumed that, and it is true, that Surrey and other parts of the southeast are relatively wealthier than other parts of the country, so there's been less proportionate for local government. So governments over the years have, when it comes to supporting councils, been more likely to allocate more support to Liverpool and Sunderland than they have been to Camberley and Godalming. And that's been a fact of life over some time. And it is the case more broadly that London and the south of England contribute net to the exchequer in a way that some other regions in the country don't. And there are historic factors behind that. There is a minister in the department that deals with this, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, called Rishi Sunak, who's a brilliant guy, who is now looking at what's called a fair funding formula, a way of making sure that while you don't take away from the north, that as economic growth develops, that we make sure that there is greater fairness towards those who've been unfairly treated in the past. But it will take a bit of time before you get to a more level playing field. In the meantime, there are efficiency measures that are being taken by the new leader of Surrey County Council, and they are mainly aimed at shrinking the sort of, they're not backroom costs, but some of the working costs of Surrey County Council. So, for example, they're no longer going to shut the community recycling centres. That threat's been taken off the table. It won't happen completely. And it is instead the case that Surrey historically has had its headquarters, County Council has had its headquarters in Kingston. That building is being sold. And it is also the case that Surrey County Council overall have 300 buildings that they own. That's shrinking to 100. Obviously, they need buildings in order to deliver the service. But Tim Oliver and also Mike Goodman, who is on the executive, have been taking these decisions, and they've been supported by county councillors like Paul Deach and Bill Chapman, who want to maintain a high level of service, but who support the new leader, Tim Oliver, in making sure that the strain taken by the council taxpayer can be relieved a bit.
Murray. Just a second, please. Wait your turn. Wait your turn, Chris, please.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, despite these, in fact, because of possibly these reductions, a huge debt faced by the county council, it is closing family community centres, child centres. Fortunately, in this area, we've managed to hold on to the two at the Old Dean and at the Orchard, just across the way. But the effect of that has been that the people working in these centres are being required to outsource and to provide the gap that's been realised. So this is a really retrograde step because these family centres have done such wonderful work, and it's a very great shame. Could I just ask about the EU? Do you actually support what Rees-Mogg is saying, that all will be great after 10 years, and that has been actually quoted? Do you actually support what your colleague Redwood has said, that he's not terribly worried about our secondary industry, and is actually contemplating a thing that we depend on service-based industries? So these are things that have been said in justification for leaving the EU. And finally, you visited Mr. Trump early in his incarnation as leader. It has been said in the worrying thing about what he's saying about nuclear weapons, that we'd be safer with a close connection with Europe, who we have some identity with, in the situation where he's talking about ripping up a number of treaties relating to nuclear weapons.
Well, three very powerful points. I'll deal with the first one. Our children's centres have very, very talented people who work in them, caring individuals who do an enormously important job. But one of the things, and I think the county councillors here would recognise it, is that while the county council provides a high quality of service, one of the weaknesses which Ofsted, the independent inspectorate, have identified have been children's services. And one of the problems, and it touches on the question from the young gentleman who asked almost I think the second question this evening, one of the weaknesses has been that we haven't effectively identified those children at most risk of harm, in greatest need, risk of abuse and neglect. Almost by definition, their parents or carers are the people least likely to go to children's centres. And it has been the case that we need to up our game as a county at dealing with those most vulnerable children. So the strategy is to ensure that the really skilled people who work in children's services, instead of being in one place where parents come to them, can now be redeployed in order to go into the homes and to work with those who suffer the most. Now, will it work? I believe it will. I believe that it's sensible, but we certainly need to think again about how we improve our support for the most vulnerable children, and that's behind it. On the second point, John Redwood and Jacob Rees-Mogg are friends and colleagues of mine, but I don't always agree with them. They voted against Mrs May's withdrawal agreement. I voted for it. John has a very sharp economic mind, but sometimes we find ourselves on different sides of the argument on economics. Jacob is the most courteous person and really thoughtful, but again, I sometimes find myself on a different side from him on one or two economic and other political questions. But you know, the critical thing to bear in mind is that there are, in political parties, a spectrum of opinions, and I think that's a good thing. I think parties should be broad tents, and coalitions, if you like. And in other political parties in this country, you have coalitions. I won't say anything about the Labour Party, but I'll mention the Green Party for a second. Two people I very much admire, Jenny Jones, Caroline Lucas. Jenny Jones in the House of Lords voted to leave the European Union. Caroline Lucas in the House of Commons, very passionate Remainer. They're the only two Green representatives in Parliament, and they take different views, but Parliament is better for having both of them there. And I think the Green Party is better, and I've got a lot of respect for the Greens, because of the fact that there's a diversity of views, but they're all united behind a particular set of concerns about the environment. And talking about the environment brings me to Donald Trump. And I think one of the things there is we've got to respect anyone who becomes president of the United States, and no matter how much we might disagree with the things that he did beforehand, the things he says, or the way he handles himself, or the decisions that he takes. And I think that our security depends actually on relationships with a variety of countries. With our intelligence relationship with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, the so-called Five Eyes relationship, helps keep us safer, and it's a chain and a link that we should preserve. But we're also in NATO, along with countries that are in the EU, manifestly, but also countries outside the EU, not just America and Canada, but Norway, which is outside the EU but in NATO. That relationship is important to us as well. And then there are other democracies elsewhere in the world that have a similar outlook to the outlook that we take, and have been helpful in helping us to deal with peacekeeping in Africa or counter-terrorism in the Middle East. So I think all of these relationships are important, and we do need to recognize that while Donald Trump may not be any of our idea of what an ideal American president should look like, sometimes we have to deal with the world as we find it rather than the world as we'd like it.
Hello again. Yes, Michael, I just have a follow-on question from your comment before regarding Brexit, and where you said that the 1 million votes were a convincing number to win. Do you feel at all that worried that the Leave EU campaign overspent the amount that they were allowed to spend on the campaign, and that there was illegal influence on social media trying to convert voters? Do you have any concerns about that?
I think a number of points and allegations have been made about the conduct of the referendum campaign. Some of them are sub judice, so some of them are still being investigated, though there have been one or two criticisms that I think no one denies against a gentleman called Aaron Banks, who was on the Leave side. He wasn't an official Leave campaigner. Indeed, the official Leave campaign did as much as they possibly could to try to make sure that Aaron Banks and his campaign wasn't given oxygen and publicity. But I don't want to say more about that. You know, I think everyone has a right to have their voice heard and respected, but he did not speak for the official Leave campaign. It was the case, however, that the Remain campaign had the support, the well-funded support of some quite powerful and influential groups, and indeed at the first stage of the campaign was able to deploy the tools of government to get its case across. Fair enough. You know, the government, the Prime Minister was arguing that we should remain. £9 million was spent sending a leaflet to all of us. I'm not sure that was the best use of public money, but the government at that time were within its rights to do that. And if I look back, I think nobody can deny that if you have a margin of more than 1 million votes, that's not going to be influenced by some of the things that are alleged to have influenced the campaign. So investigations go on. I'm always happy to reflect on any, any points that are made. But as I say, the criticism of Mr. Banks is not a criticism of the official Leave campaign. It was a criticism of a participant who had his own particular bus to ride, as it were.
Gentleman at the back.
So, Doug Baker from Lightwater again. Could you not remind us that your official campaign that you were, was it chair of as well, was also found guilty of electoral spending offences? Wasn't that the 10% over? So it's not just Aaron Banks, it's also your campaign. And it doesn't really matter if you can't prove that it makes a difference. I mean, if you take a sporting analogy, could any of the people that Lance Armstrong beat prove that the drug taking allowed him to beat them? So surely it's the cheating itself is the problematic aspect.
It's a very good analogy, but the reason why I use the phrase sub judice is that there are appeals going on. I mean, I think that the judgment that was made raises as many questions as it answers, and there are a variety of reasons why the attribution of unfairness, in particular to individuals, but also to the Leave campaign, I think is not the Electoral Commission's finest hour. But because there are processes ongoing, it's difficult for me to say more than that. But I think anyone who wants to and who looks at the Electoral Commission's own report will conclude that there are significant questions to answer about the conclusions they came to.
Thank you. Paul?
Well, the two things that I would say are actually, the first thing, the allegation that was made, the processes that were conducted, I was not aware of at the time. I was involved politically, yes, in the campaign, but not in the administration of the funding. The second thing is that actually on 2 occasions, the individuals who were criticised were cleared of all wrongdoing. Then it was only at the 3rd time of asking that a judgment that was made that was adverse to them. But there's subsequently been a number of things that have been said and revealed that suggest that that adverse judgment is itself questionable. So it is a complex area, and I think that out of respect to all those involved, and out of respect to those people on the Electoral Commission who are under pressure but who've been trying to do the right thing, the best thing that I can do is wait until the wheels of justice have finally finished rolling.
Hello, it's Barbara from Lightwater. 2 areas of concern, relating a little bit to poverty. When we talk about poverty in 2019, I always think about my father, who was born in Wales. I was a child in the 1920s and 30s, and I believe that was true poverty. But today, talking about today, 2 areas that do concern me. That 0-hour contracts, I do feel that people in those sort of having those contracts or non-contracts are in a very, very difficult position because they actually don't know how many hours they're going to be working, what their income's going to be. And then those sort of people going to food banks, I can understand. But my other concern is we see so much about single mothers with their children, but there's never any mention of the fathers. Where are these fathers? Why are they not paying to bring up their children? Why are my taxes paying to bring up some feckless man's children? Really and truly.
Well, I think there are several very good points there. The first is that the definition of poverty changes over time. Of course, it's the case that the poverty that your family would have faced in South Wales in the 1920s and 1930s is a different kind to the poverty that people face now. But there is poverty in our country. There are people who do without, and sometimes that's because of economic circumstances, sometimes because of other factors. And as you said right at the very beginning of your question, we should show compassion towards them, and that links to the second point, 0 hours contracts. A flexible labour market can sometimes mean that 0 hours contracts are things that people willingly enter into. But I do have concerns about the way in which they've grown and they've been used, and so does the Prime Minister, which is why she commissioned an inquiry into what's been called the gig economy. And I have concerns. I sometimes in London will use Uber. And it is cheap and accessible and convenient, and because the journey can be easily traced, if my teenage daughter is in an Uber, I know that she's safe by definition. Every step of the journey, no harm can befall her. That's a good thing. But at the same time, the people who are driving those cars, they're effectively employees, but they don't have their national insurance, their pension contributions and other things paid for them. And I just don't think that's fair. And I would willingly pay a little bit more or decide to use public transport instead of it in order to make sure that the people who worked in those conditions were properly paid. And I think the same applies in a number of areas. There are companies like Uber and also Amazon, in the way in which people work in their warehouses, who frankly are exploitative, and it is just not fair. If people are willing to work, then they deserve a fair wage and to be treated humanely. On your final point, there are all sorts of difficult circumstances in which people might find themselves that mean that they are a single parent. It might be the case that they fall in love and then they discover that the individual concerned is not everything that they imagined that individual would be, and the individual, the male, behaves in a way that means that nobody would really want to have him around the house or act as father. Now, there are some circumstances in which you can make sure that that individual, if they're earning, contributes obviously to the care of the child, but it can also be the case that you can have individuals who, through bereavement or other factors, find themselves bringing up baby on their own, men and women. I do agree with you that there's a particular responsibility on men to behave better, and if they are involved at a very early stage in the creation of a child, to try and take on that responsibility. But I also think that what we need to recognize is that that child, whatever the circumstances of its birth, also needs to have the support and security which is the best that we can give it. And that sometimes makes me think that even if the father has behaved appallingly, that shouldn't be visited on the child, and we need to make sure that the mother and the child have the support they need in order to ensure that the child can grow up in the right sorts of circumstances.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry, we are so many questions, and we're out of time. But I mean, it would be very good if you could say thank you to Michael for coming, and very much appreciate it, and look forward to the next time, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you all very much, and in particular, thank you to Andrew for allowing us to use this hall in this wonderful church, and to the St Mary's team. The next Q&A is not one where I'll be speaking, it's one where I'll be chairing, as I say, on the 22nd in Lightwater, and we'll have Heathrow personnel coming there to explain. And then if you visit my website, it will also have details of future Q&As, and also if you visit my website, you can download a little panel so that you can receive a monthly newsletter from me, which keeps you up to date with the things that I'm doing and the things that our friends and colleagues in Surrey Heath Borough Council and Surrey County Council are doing as well. Thank you all very much. Thank you.